Are you concerned about the growing influence of political extremism, hyperpolarization, and misinformation? Well, you're not alone. This is the American Values Coalition podcast, where we explore the root causes of these societal ills and provide you with strategies to counter them.
There's sometimes this attitude of not just that it's okay to cut off contact with people, but you almost have an obligation. Or when you're talking with someone who you disagree about big things, you have an obligation to focus on the areas of disagreement. And otherwise, you're complicit. And I don't think that's true.
Do you have a friend or family member that's been caught up in right-wing political extremism and misinformation? This episode is for you. If you're a regular listener of AVC, you know that we help families and friends of people who've been caught up in those sorts of things. Probably most of our listeners are probably on the right side of the political spectrum, center right, far right, something like that. But I suspect we have some who are with us because you are on the left side of the political spectrum, but you have friends and family members who are conservatives, and you're maybe having difficulty reaching them and understanding how to talk to them. Well, this episode is for you. Now, if that doesn't describe you, don't go away. I'm sure this will be a very interesting episode for everyone. So please stick around and check us out. So my guest today is David Litt. He's a former senior speechwriter for President Barack Obama. He's also a New York Times bestselling author and was a semifinalist for the James Thurber Prize for American Humor. You can find his writing in the New York Times, The Atlantic, and a bunch of other places. Sometimes he's a guest on CNN, MSNBC, and even appeared once on Newsmax, but has not been invited back. I'm sure they just lost his email. David was also the head writer and producer for Funny or Die DC from 2016 to 2018. His newest book is called It's Only Drowning, A True Story of Learning to Surf and Search for Common Ground. You can see the cover right over his right shoulder there. But David really got my attention from a New York Times op-ed that I saw. The title was, "Is it time to stop snubbing your right-wing family?" Of course, that really spoke to me. I was like, oh, I got to check this out. Of course, if you're a regular listener, you know that for us, the answer is no. It's also, spoiler alert, the answer for the author as well. So David Litt, welcome to the AVC podcast.
Thank you. Although I will say, I think, at least for me, the answer was yes, wasn't it? That it is time to stop snubbing people.
Yeah, I misread the my brain went like in the opposite direction.
No worries.
Yes, the answer is yes.
Wanted to set the record straight.
Yes, it is time to stop snubbing your right-wing family. Yes. So tell us, give us a little bit of the backstory. How did this book come about?
Sure. Well, and thank you for having me on the podcast. So this book really, for me, was originally a book that had absolutely nothing to do with anything other than surfing, because I started surfing 3 years ago at the advanced age of 35, and I got hooked, and I said, okay, this is, I'm embarrassing myself, so that's always funny, but I'm also learning things about success and how to define success. I'm learning about fear and how to handle fear. I'm learning about risk and how to decide how much risk is right for you as you try something new, maybe later in life. And all of those things, plus the surfing, I was like, oh, that's the book. And what changed is that the person I was surfing the most with is my brother-in-law, so was and still is, my brother-in-law, Matt, my wife's younger brother. And Matt and I are super different. I mean, I have been a writer my whole adult life. Matt's an electrician. Matt is covered in tattoos. I don't even do temporary tattoos. That's too much commitment for me. Matt listens to death metal. I listen to show tunes, right? We're very, very different people. Matt's a big Joe Rogan fan. I used to write speeches for President Obama. And during the pandemic in particular, those differences felt like they weren't just matters of taste. They were signifying who we were, and they were really fault lines. And it's interesting the way headlines work with an op-ed, right? So the op-ed was kind of about a broader issue. I wouldn't describe Matt as right-wing, He's more sort of libertarian leaning, and he doesn't vote, which is another big difference between us. But he's kind of the Joe Rogan fan and that demographic, which I think has really been responsible for some of the right wing's recent success. And what I realized as I started writing this book was that really what began as a story about surfing became more than that, a story about this unlikely friendship and the friendship that was forming between Matt and me as we surfed. And so, in a way, the sort of central tension or question of the book is, can these two people on the opposite sides of every fault line that's tearing our country apart still find a way to become friends?
And was it the political, or so would it be things he learned from Joe Rogan of a political nature that would sort of turn you off at first and make you wonder whether this is really, a relationship that can continue?
Well, I think it's a more complicated question than I would have said it was when I started surfing with Matt. So on one hand, part of the distance between us was these kind of this idea of sort of shared information, right? I would say the issue of vaccines was the one that really made me feel like I had almost a civic responsibility not to be overly friendly, right? It was this idea, and I was wrong to think this, and I wrote the piece in part to talk about being wrong. Um, I I felt like, and I think it wasn't that I articulated, it was just kind of a in the air, this sense of, if you're not going to do the civically responsible thing and get vaccinated, then people shouldn't be go out of their way to be friendly to you. And you should almost pay a social cost, and that will help people realize, hey, I don't want to pay that social cost, so I will sort of join the group of society, the majority of society that is getting vaccinated. Um, that obviously didn't work, and also was not particularly. So you asked sort of where the distance came from. In part, I think it came from me, right? It was my thinking about it. In part, I think it also came from this sense that we live sometimes in two very separate information universes. So even when we're thinking about the same thing, we're thinking about, the Jeffrey Epstein scandal or the drones that were sighted over in New Jersey a couple of months ago, or housing costs, right? Where we get our information and what we end up believing as kind of core beliefs that we then build judgments on, those are often very different. And I think, 10, 20 years ago, it was probably a lot easier for people to say, okay, we have just completely different worldviews, but we still spend time together. We're still friendly. And that's less and less true. I'm not saying it doesn't exist. I'm sure some of you listening right now have those relationships in your life, but I'm also sure that many of you can think of a relationship like that where you say, yeah, it's has gotten corroded by politics at a moment when everything feels like politics.
Yeah. So on this podcast and in our newsletter, we talk a lot about the right wing media bubble and how folks are just sort of in this bubble, information bubble, where they're not getting the complete picture, or in some cases, a lot of misinformation. But there is a left wing media bubble as well, right? And I think that's where you see this this idea that actually you should be snubbing your right wing, your MAGA family member, right? Is that something that you hear a lot?
Well, I think it's interesting these days on the sort of MAGA universe. I think there's several media bubbles, right? You can be listening to sort of the most Trump ride or die outlets, right? You can be a more traditional Fox News conservative. You can be, you can be a sort of Elon Musk social media member of the MAGA coalition, or you can kind of be the Joe Rogan um, type of, more recent libertarian leaning, often younger and more male MAGA voter. And those are all, there's overlap, but there's actually kind of bubbles within bubbles. And I think then in the center left and the center, I think, there's absolutely information bubbles because we all live in information bubbles. I think the biggest absence of information, or one of the biggest, is this sense of we don't really spend a lot of time thinking about people like Matt, or we don't spend as much time thinking about people like Matt or taking people seriously, right? So in other words, and this is something, the book itself is really a story, right? It's not a manifesto. And I believe in showing rather than telling, but I also think it's important to tell a story knowing what you want the moral to be. And for me, the moral is not about false equivalency, right? Or moral relativism. So I don't think that my decision to get vaccinated and Matt's decision to get vaccinated were equally good, or sorry, to not get vaccinated, were equally good decisions. I think I made the right choice. I think Matt made the wrong choice. Now, of course, he would probably feel the opposite way about that. Um, the question is why, right? Why do people make the decisions they make? What's going on in their lives? Who, as you pointed out, are they listening to or getting information from? And I think to a large extent, um, or let me put it this way, to an extent that is far too great, the uh, sort of people demographically like me are only getting information about Matt almost from an academic sense of what are these people up to and how can we win some of their votes, or at least enough of their votes that, Trumpism and white nationalism go away. And I think that is felt through the overall sort of the electorate and through our society, where people feel like, hey, there's a lot of people who are not paying attention to us in a full way, and I think that's a fair criticism.
Yeah, and I think you're right. I mean, I love your idea about there are different media bubbles that people live in, not just like the right and the left. Um, but and I do agree. Like for us to really get out of this situation we're in, where we're becoming increasingly divided, it is going to take those one-on-one relationships. But you can't go into the relationship just like I'm here to tell this person the right stuff,
Hmm.
and they're going to learn from me, and not really sort of seeing it as a two-way relationship.
Yeah, I think you hit on something really important. One of the reasons that surfing ended up being the kind of neutral ground where Matt and I could become unlikely friends is that it was an area, he's a very good surfer and I am not. And so when we were spending time together, more often than not, it was on sort of his turf, so to speak. And it was more than that, an area where I looked up to him, right? Even though he's my wife's younger brother, so he's a couple years younger than me as well, right? Like it almost felt like he was the adult in the room when we were in the water. And I think that there was never any question that I had a lot to learn from Matt on a surfboard, but I was surprised by how much I learned from him about both surfing and life in general. And one of the things that I think is important, or at least in my own experience has been important, is when I feel like when I go into a conversation saying, "What can I learn from you?" And it doesn't mean how can I agree with you on everything, but saying there's something in your experience, in your life, in your way of seeing the world that I will find fascinating and can learn something from. And if you go in with that spirit, at least this has been true in my case, then I think it's a lot easier to build that foundation, and people are much more likely to reciprocate. Not that they always will, but that it increases the odds.
Yeah. So what would your advice be to someone who says they have a friend or family member who's just really deep into MAGA media in some way, and they just kind of stop talking to them at some point? They're listening to this podcast or thinking about reestablishing that relationship. What would be your advice to them? They're not interested in surfing, so what would be your advice to them?
Okay, well, if they're not interested in surfing, no, I mean, for me, this was always very much a kind of whatever your version of surfing is, book and idea. And so, I mean, I would start, I think, with a little bit of humility and saying, hey, no two relationships between two people are the same. And it definitely makes a difference that, that Matt is not, like a hardcore right wing nationalist guy, or, if he were a neo-Nazi, I don't know that we'd be surfing together, right? I want to acknowledge that.
Hmm.
At the same time, I think a lot. So there's really two questions here. One is sort of more, or three actually. One is moral, one is self-interested, and one is sort of strategic, right? So morally, how should you relate to people who have views that you deeply disagree with? And I think um, that's the most complicated, frankly, of those questions. It's also probably the least relevant right now. From a self-interested perspective, I think that most of the time, if you otherwise enjoy someone's company, then I think it's okay to continue to enjoy their company. And I feel like I see this a lot in the online world that I live in. There's sometimes this attitude of not just that it's okay to cut off contact with people, that but you almost have an obligation, or when you're talking with someone who you disagree and you disagree about big things, you have an obligation to focus on the areas of disagreement, and otherwise you're complicit. And I don't think that's true. um, I would almost say the opposite, right? Focus on something that isn't an area of disagreement. Focus on what I call neutral ground, and that could be, you watch the same TV show, or you have the same hobby, or ideally you're doing the same activity. You're working together, but in a way that has nothing to do with the stuff that is tearing us apart. And then the last thing I'll say is strategic, which is, I don't think in most cases that being friends with someone will convince them to leave their bubble, even if it's kind of a date. I want to be clear, right? I think that, for example, if you're really into Joe Rogan, I might disagree with some of the things you're hearing, some of the information you're getting. I might be like, I don't think that's right. But I don't think it's as toxic to our society as if you're like deep in the white nationalist neo-Nazi spaces, right? There's lots of different possibilities here. I think in general, people don't change their minds very quickly, but I also think that there's openings, right? And there's moments when people start to say, and I think this happens to all of us if we're curious people, regardless of what you believe, where you say, hey, wait a second, I had a set of assumptions and something changed. And now I'm wondering if those assumptions are really as rock solid as I thought. And when you have those moments, the most likely or the way you become most likely to change your mind is to have someone else in your life who has a different set of beliefs or assumptions or views about the world. And so if you say, listen, I'm beginning to think my bubble might not have it totally right, but I don't know anyone anywhere else, and the only people I do know cut me off and tell me I'm a terrible person, that doesn't change people's minds. What changes people's minds is people being open and saying, okay, well, you're now at a point where you want to learn more about how I see the world. Sure, I'll tell you, right? Not in a place of I want to debate you, but just in a space of mutual curiosity. And yeah, so that was kind of a long answer, but I think it's at the same time it's a complicated topic.
Yeah, yeah, that's good. I mean, um, whenever you think about entering a conversation to change somebody's mind, just think about the last time how often you change your own mind, and you
Yeah.
realize, oh, yeah, maybe it's not fair to just assume someone's going to change their mind that quickly.
Well, and the other thing I would say is think about a time you changed your mind, and the odds of changing your mind about something big and subjective, not what time is it, and someone says, hey, your watch is running fast or whatever, but a big issue of beliefs. It's almost never somebody saying, hey, you're totally wrong and you're a bad person for thinking what you think. That's
No.
just our natural instinct as humans, no matter what you believe, is to kind of turtle up in those moments. And I think if you want to be persuasive, then it's important to think about how people actually end up being persuaded.
Yeah, and I think one of the big issues we have these days is that when you and actually it's in the polling data when you look at folks on the right and the left is that we have misunderstandings of each of the other side. Like people on the right don't understand what people on the left
Yeah.
believe. People on the left don't understand what people on the right believe. So just having those relationships, even if it doesn't have to be about changing minds, it can be about just understanding each other better, and that
Yeah,
will lead to a better society as well.
I think that's right. I will say two things about that. So one, I do think that the flip side of this is there are a lot of people, and I would include the current president of the United States among that category, who their uh, fortunes would be substantially worse if the country were less divided. So I don't think it's mere polarization is a sort of natural phenomenon. I think we might naturally be trending that way because of social media and all this other stuff, but also there's a lot of people who are pushing it along because it benefits them, either politically or financially or both. Um, the other thing that I will say about that is I do think that the um, that sense of listening to each other, right? I mean, so much of this comes down to you can respect people without respecting every one of their opinions. And the reverse is true as well. I mean, I think it's a very common defensive tactic that I often hear, and some people have, who have uh, not enjoyed my book as much as I would have hoped, or frankly, as much as I'm happy to say, I think most people have, who have read it, right? They say, well, David doesn't agree with me about X, and therefore he doesn't respect me. Well, not really, right? We don't have to agree on everything for me to say, hey, I still think that we are fundamentally, going back to the Declaration of Independence, right? We are created equal. And that's a very different thing than saying each of our opinions is equally valid.
Yeah, so I spend too much time on Blue Sky, which tends to be more of a lefty bubble. And so I was noticing like the reactions to your op-ed, and a lot of folks really did not appreciate what you were saying. They were like, "No, you can't be friends with these people." I don't know if you
Yeah,
saw some of those reactions.
I saw a few. No, I think to me, what's interesting is, and this was the op-ed in this op-ed in particular, right? I think almost by definition, if you're the kind of person who enjoys commenting on op-eds on the internet, this is maybe, and it doesn't mean that I do want to say it's not a total cop out, right? Like people can have very valid criticisms, and some of it I was like, okay, if I could do everything again, there's some things I would write differently or more clearly for sure. But I think if you're the kind of person who enjoys commenting on a stranger's op-ed on social media, and that's true on Twitter or Blue Sky or Instagram or you name it, you're probably not the kind of person who is saying, I want to be persuasive or I'm interested in learning from people who see the world differently. And so I think it's one of, but it's a real challenge that the sort of, as we hear a lot, which is true, that the internet is not real life, but the internet is the loudest part of real life. And I think that's one of the, again, we're talking about polarization. And I will also say the people who benefit from polarization, right? There's a lot of people who say, wait a second, if I, there's, who can kind of say, hey, this is a very easy way to generate engagement on my social media page, or you get a lot of likes, and that's very addictive. And I'm not saying that as somebody who is immune to that. I'm saying that as someone who has from time to time fallen into that trap.
Yeah, Amanda Ripley has this great term, conflict entrepreneurs, to describe people like
Mm.
that.
Yeah, I think, and the other thing that I will say about that I think is important is, because you were talking about how people on kind of both sides misunderstand each other, and it's not that we misunderstand each other and ever are too kind to the people that we don't fully understand, right? If we said, hey, I don't know the explanation, but I'm going to come up with an explanation for this person's behavior, and actually it turns out it's more charitable than it should be. um it, I think, it has happened in the past, but I don't think for the most part that's how we see each other, especially now, 10 years after Trump started running. And I think you see this a lot left of center, for example. You see a lot of people who just refuse to, or are baffled by, I guess that's what I'd say, the idea that someone could vote for Donald Trump thinking that he would only deport dangerous criminals, even though that's what he said on the campaign trail. And obviously I'm not surprised that he is doing these mass deportations that are going after, everybody, including people who have obeyed the law ever since they came here. But people are genuinely surprised by that. And so sometimes it's this idea of saying, oh no, you must support all of this, rather than saying you're surprised by it, right? And I understand that. I think it is challenging to understand why people might support a policy you find not just incorrect, but morally repugnant, right? And I think,
Hmm.
and that's the, and I think that, by the way, the same, I'm sure, again, it's not equivalent, but they're the same category. I'm sure the same is true of, for example, somebody who believes that abortion is literally murder, right? I'm sure they might make assumptions as to why I believe that women should have the right to choose. And I think and the other assumption that I will add is, there's or a broader point. There was a piece that Gabriel Sherman did, I think, for New York Magazine years and years and years ago about Fox News, and he quoted an executive there who said people think that Fox News is about pushing conservative, thoughts, and that's not what Fox News is about at all. Fox News is about protecting our listeners from people who hate them. Right? That's ultimately the biggest lie that Fox News tells. is that they, right, the left, however you want to define it, hate you.
Mm-hmm.
And it's funny to me, and by the way, it goes back to proximity and friendship. I have people in my life who watch a lot of Fox News, but they also know that, like, you know, if asked, they would sort of have to say, well, Democrats are not universally hateful, because I happen to know at least some of them, and we all get along, right? We're friendly to each other. It doesn't mean that I think that Fox News is not a very bad sort of thing for our society, but it does mean that the central premise of Fox News works best when people don't actually know anyone who might be considered "quote unquote" part of the left.
Yeah, and again, the op-ed we're referring to was published July 13th of this year, and it's called "Is It Time to Stop Snubbing Your Right-Wing Family?" We included a gift link in our newsletter, so you can check out our newsletter if you want to get the gift link for that article. One last question, sort of a broad one. I noticed you write about politics, but you're also a humor writer. So just give me your thoughts on humor as a communication tool or a pedagogical tool. How do you view that?
Well, yes, and my guess is from this conversation, people will be surprised to know that I wrote jokes for Obama and not just regular speeches, or that, frankly, It's Only Drowning, this new book, to me is first and foremost funny, right? Like, that's the, I when I get emails from people that say, I was on the train, or I was at Target or something listening to your audiobook, and people were giving me weird looks because I was laughing hard. That, to me, as a writer, is very gratifying, and it's largely what I set out to do. Um, but what I will say, to think more, how to put this in a more intellectual way, about the role of humor, I would say that the role of humor has been overstated, or certainly was in the first Trump term. There was this idea that comedy will speak truth to power and save us. I just don't think that's right. Where I do think humor can be very valuable is it's a point of connection, right? If two people can laugh at the same thing, then that means that there has to be something they agree on, some shared truth. It's one of the reasons why comedy is splintering at the same time the rest of culture is splintering. But I'll give you a specific example, and I sort of write about it in the book, but it's only a couple of sentences. Matt and I, there's a lot of comedy that we don't sort of listen to. He likes one set of stuff, I like another, so on. But we both like South Park a lot, and that, again, it's this kind of neutral ground, right? Sometimes South Park's making fun of liberals, sometimes it's making fun of conservatives. Recently, they made fun of Trump pretty brutally. Um, but overall, I think we just enjoy it, and I think that is very helpful. I mean, when I wrote for President Obama, I would often think about a joke, not really about being hilarious, but just about getting everyone in the audience kind of smiling and nodding. Because he would speak to people who didn't agree with him, right? I mean, he would speak to audiences of people, and we never said, this has to be full of Democrats or anything like that. It was about talking to Americans, and you would see people say, you could almost sometimes see individual people where you could almost see it in their eyes, where it's like, all right, you got me on this one, right? I didn't vote for you, wouldn't vote for you again, but I'm a little bit more open to at least listening to what you have to say, because you got me, nodding along a little bit. So I think that is important. I think but if somebody says, I want to save the world, I'm going to become a comedy writer, I'd say those two things, one does not follow from the other.
All right. And the book is It's Only Drowning. David Litt, thank you so much for joining the AVC podcast.
Well, thank you for having me.